Hello, friends. My name is Eric Cloward, and welcome to the Stoic Coffee Break. The Stoic Coffee Break is a weekly podcast where I take an aspect of Stoicism and do my best to break it down to its most important points. Oftentimes, that's me just discussing a topic of Stoicism that's important to me and sharing my experiences. Other times, that's me interviewing other people or being interviewed. And this week's episode is an interview I did for the podcast Knowledge Brews Supreme. The host of that is John Chancey. He has a doctorate in education. He's down in Oklahoma City, and we had a really great conversation. We ended up talking probably about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and just a really good time. John is a very smart, very interesting, and very warm person, and this was a really fun interview to do. So I am going to rebroadcast that here this week, and next week I will have another new episode ready for you. But until that time, enjoy my discussion with Dr. John Chancey.
My guest for today's show is the one and only Eric Cloward, who is the host of one of my absolute favorite podcasts. It's called the Stoic Coffee Break Podcast. It's an awesome podcast to check it out if you haven't done so already. Eric drops a weekly episode. Usually it's centered around a topic related to Stoic philosophy. The episodes are usually somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes in length, or about the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. They drop on Sunday nights, and I usually find myself walking my dog Monday morning, listening, along to start our day as we're walking through our neighborhood. So love this show. Can't say enough good things about it. Absolutely had to have a fellow podcaster on, and so happy to have Eric here on the show today. So with all that said, welcome to Knowledge Brews Supreme. Eric, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
Of course. So, I've only sort of briefly beginning to scratch the surfaces of Stoicism, philosophy. Like I've read a few books, kind of introductory books. I remember a little bit of what I learned in intro philosophy, but when I got interested into Stoicism, I looked for podcasts, and yours is one of the first that came up, and I was immediately hooked. So what I'm curious about initially is how did you come across or find Stoicism? Did somebody introduce you to this topic, or did you find it on your own? And kind of relatedly, what was it that attracted you specifically to Stoicism?
Okay. Yeah, so I have Tim Ferriss to blame for it, which I'm sure a lot of people do as well. And I've been listening to and reading Tim stuff for years. I think I picked up the 4-Hour Work Week, like plenty of people. Shortly after it came out, I was at Barnes & Noble and just happened to see it, picked it up. And while I didn't necessarily implement everything that Tim did or anything like that, I'm a software developer, and that's what I've been doing for years. What I appreciated about Tim and what I appreciate about him going forward is that he's willing to really test things in a way and push himself to trying to find great ways to do things better. And I know a lot of people bag on him, but I think Tim is probably at least my impression of him is he's probably one of the most self-aware people. Like, he knows that he makes plenty of mistakes, and he's willing to do his best to own those, and his willingness to continue to push himself and push those limits is always very impressive. And so I really just dig a lot of his podcasts. And there was one where he mentioned that one of his favorite books, and a book that changed his life, was called A Guide to the Good Life, the Ancient Art of Stoic Joy by William Irvine. And I was like, and I'm kind of a wordsmith. I have a very large vocabulary. I love words. Etymology is something that's very, very interesting to me. I speak fluent German, and so having another language under my belt, it makes me appreciate the English language and how strange and complex and powerful it is. German is very much the same way. And I was like, Stoic joy, that sounds very very contradictory or paradoxical. And so I was like, okay, let's see what this is about. And I honestly had no idea that Stoicism was a philosophy at the time. I just knew the term Stoic, and was just like, okay, somebody's Stoic and they're very, unemotional or whatever. And I was like, your typical definition of it. So I bought the book, read it, and some things clicked for me. I was like, okay, that's cool, but it didn't really sink in. And so I think it was probably about maybe 3 or 4 months after reading that I was like, okay, I need to get to the point where I can truly understand this and somehow integrate this, because it's kind of one of those things where I got the feeling that this is really important, but I just didn't understand it. It's
Sure.
like when you go to a class or some kind of lecture and somebody's talking about something that just feels so over your head, and you know that it's important, but your brain is just like not grokking it, and you're trying to pull those things in. So I bought the audiobook and would listen to it on my way to and from work. And it was then for, those 20-minute drives that I would have those aha moments like, oh, okay, bam,
Yeah.
that, that's what I missed before. And so listening to it that second time really, really helped me kind of get a grip on a lot of those things. And this was in 2017. And so come up on the new year, and like I said, one of my New Year's resolutions for 2018 was to start a podcast. And I was like, okay, I had tried starting a podcast before. I wanted to do it called the soundtrack.fm was what it was about, because I love music. I love musical
Oh,
soundtracks
cool.
and stuff like that. It's like Hans Zimmer, just like a fanboy over him all day. um so things like that, where I was just like, this is something I want to do. Tried making an episode or two of that. I did not like how it turned out at all.
Wow.
um and plus then I looked into the legal restrictions on it, and to get legal rights to actually use the music, I was like, it was such a gray area. I was like, I don't know if this is something I could do. So come to New Year's on in 2018, and just before that, Amazon popped up and said, "Hey, I think you would really like this journal by Ryan Holiday." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, I'll buy
Yeah.
that." So I got that one, and I started writing in it, and I was like, "Okay, I need to make a podcast. What should I talk about?" I'm like, "Well, these Stoic ideas keep percolating through my mind all day, and this is like a week into the new year." So I'm like, "Well, I'll just do one on Stoicism, and you know what? It's probably going to really suck, but I'm just going to put it out there anyway." And what I did was I used my phone and I used Anchor, which was okay at the time.
Yeah.
And the reason why I did that, even though I have all this audio equipment because I'm a musician and I have tons of gear, just like every musician has now, I probably have. It wouldn't surprise me if $5,000 worth of gear. So,
Oh, wow.
um, but it was overwhelming. It was overwhelming for me to sit down and try and do that, even though I had Logic Pro, I have Ableton, all of these things I could do all of these nice recordings on. It kept getting in my way because I was like, okay, how am I going to make it sound good? All of these things. So I was just like, fine, I'll just record it on my phone, put it out there, even if it totally sucked. So I started doing that. And my ex-partner, like I said, we're still great friends, said, hey, I know you're doing this. I'm not going to let you quit until you do 100 episodes.
Oh,
And
wow.
I
How
was like,
cool.
okay. And she was just like, it's like you give up on things too easy when they get tough. So you have to do 100 episodes for me. And I was like, okay, I'll do it. Ended up doing 137 episodes in a row. So every single day. And then recognized that it was taking up a lot of time, and it was fine. It was what I needed to build that body of work
Sure.
so that I had that momentum going. And then I turned it into a weekly one after that, did another 30 episodes, and then just kind of felt burnt out. And so I took a break for about a year and a half. And then COVID hit, and I was doing a lot of journaling during COVID just because it's what you did. Everything was
Yeah,
kind of falling apart, and you were like, "Oh my gosh, what? I need to keep my sanity." And just had a lot of ideas. And so I started back up after about a year and a half, did it for a year. And then at that point, my personal relationship and just other things just kind of were falling apart. And I felt like an absolute hypocrite trying to talk about these things, saying, here's how to have a great life. And my life was just falling, going completely to shit. So like, okay. So I took 6 months off, and I was just like, and under the guise of it's going to be working on learning some new skills and in Unreal Engine, and because I'm a programmer, and 3D design, other stuff, it was always something interesting to me. And I did step up and do some of that, and then found that I had absolutely no motivation to study for it, do anything with it. And it was just like, okay, I'm not sure what's going on. And so I just let myself kind of coast for about 6 months, just trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I was definitely in a bit of a depression, and just like I said, my main relationship had fallen apart.
Right.
COVID was going on, and was just really struggling with a lot of things. And then um, had some experiences over that summer. So I guess probably beginning of this last, so beginning of summer and springtime. 2022, where I learned a few big lessons, kind of ran into some big walls and went, oh my gosh, here's this giant wall I've been, pushing up against. And I took a step back and ran head on into it and went, oh crap, here's this wall I've been hitting all this time. Now I understand this. And it was a really big lesson for me. And I was like, you know what, the way that I need to process this, I wrote a whole thing on it. It was probably about 5 or 6 pages, I think and then I turned it into an episode. And I think it ended up being almost like 18 minutes, which is definitely on the longer side for mine.
Sure.
And it was all about understanding that you need to be your own source of love and self-esteem, and you can't outsource that to anybody else.
So true.
And because it was such a powerful and important lesson, I was like, okay, if I'm learning this, and this is definitely making some big changes in my life, I need to share this with other people again. And so I started it up back in, I think this was maybe June, started the podcast back up and been doing it since. And I feel like in the last 6 months since I started back up again, I guess going in 7 months now, I've had some of the best episodes that I've ever had. I mean, I get done with them and go, okay, that really worked for me. And trying to had a thought there and it just fell out of my brain. But what I found is just that I just had a lot more to say that I wasn't sure about. And even though, like I said, my primary relationship had fallen apart, and we're still good friends, we still care about each other very deeply. She's an amazing person. Yeah, you'll never find me speak poorly of her, just because she's great. And a lot of the problems were just me and dealing with the trauma and everything that I had growing up, and finally confronting that and finding healthier ways to be. There was a lot of codependency in the relationship from my side, simply because, and this ties back, and I'll bring this up and we can talk about this more a little later, but what that lesson in understanding that you have to be your own source of love was that on the flip side of that, there was that codependency with it. And so while I was working on this, I was having a hard time letting go of this. So
Sure.
I was like working on the love part, but I hadn't figured out how to let go of the codependency part. And the thing is that if you rely on somebody else for your source of love, or being that source of love for you, and you don't have it within yourself, it doesn't matter how much somebody else loves you, it will never be enough. It will never fill you.
Yeah.
And so they can pour all the love they can onto you and be the best and most amazing partner and do all of these amazing things for you, but it will never be enough love for you until you learn how to love yourself. And that was one of the biggest things that I learned this last year. And over the last probably 2-3 months, I've had so many big aha moments and things where I felt like I had all these puzzle pieces and I had sections of the puzzle kind of put together, but still plenty of them that weren't. But I had all these pieces, and finally, over the last few months, like the full picture of the puzzle emerged, and I went, okay, now I understand where all of these things are coming from, why I acted the way that I did, where all of these things are, and how to move past them. And having that big picture has just been phenomenal. So the last few months have just been massive growth, massive changes for me. And yeah, it's been wonderful. The other thing that has happened is back in September, I sprained my ankle really, really badly. And I've been getting back in shape. I'd been walking a lot and cycling and everything, and trying to get back into that, because that was great for my mental health. So when that happened, and then September, October is when the rain started to hit here. And so between that, relationship failing, and then all of these things kind of cascaded back down, and I definitely fell into a bit of a pit again. And then around Christmas, New Year's, kind of reemerged from that. And so things are really on an upward trajectory right now, and just feeling really good about life. So anyway, that's kind of, I talk a lot. I'm a bit long-winded, which you wouldn't think so from my episodes, because they're only like 10-15 minutes, but
no, I love it. This is great. I do want to kind of touch on something you mentioned earlier. You talked about, like, initially, I just find this fascinating, kind of the origin stories behind podcasts, because you said at the time, your partner at the time said, hey, I'm not going to let you quit till you get to 100 episodes. One of my first, within the first 10 guests I had on my show, shout out to BJ Gador, one of my former guests on this show. We talked about podcasting afterwards, because he's a fellow content maker, podcaster. And he said, hey, if you're going to stay in the game of making podcasts, get to 100 episodes. If you just don't even worry about who listens, get to 100 episodes. If you can do that, people will come. They'll find you. If you just put it out there, eventually it will. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter if it starts off bad at the beginning, kind of like you were saying, hey, just put it out there, whatever it sounds like, great. So I think that's really cool to kind of hear that. It's kind of a similar origin story. I find that stuff sort of fascinating. So that number 100, I think, is if you can get to that point, you've really got something going. And I'm just so happy that you're continuing to put out such great content that you did not stop at 100. It's and also just happy you're back making content as well. So I I want to now kind of talk about stoicism sort of at large. You touched on this a little bit, so maybe I kind of know your answer, but I'd love to hear a little more in depth. But what do you think is the biggest misconception people have generally about stoicism? Like it's not just about being quiet and the reserved, kind of like that strong, silent Gary Cooper type that Tony Soprano talked about. What do you think? Is that what else do you think, or is there other misconceptions people have, or how would you address that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's the core misconception is that Stoics are, it's all about emotional repression. And it's not, it has absolutely nothing to do with repressing emotions. I mean, Stoics absolutely feel their emotions, but what they do, at least what I work on doing, is just understanding that where those emotions come from.
Sure.
We like to think we always put the onus of our emotions, not always, but too often we put the onus for our emotions on somebody else.
Yes.
So even just this week, I had somebody that I was very close to kind of freak out on me, and they're a bit emotionally immature. I absolutely adore them, and they're a wonderful person. Obviously, I'm not going to name names, but
Sure. That's okay.
got really upset with me, and just like you made me so angry, I'm starting to cry. We were texting about some stuff, and it was like, and I didn't want to step up and say, well, actually, the emotions are coming from the thoughts in your mind, and if you would think better thoughts, then you wouldn't be mad. I didn't say that or anything. I said, well, I'm sorry that you're having a really hard time with this, and uh, and I talk about this quite a bit. Is that our language is structured in a way that we externalize what happens to us. We put the blame for what happens in our lives on everything outside of ourselves. We have a hard time understanding that our perspective, how we view the world, truly is the way that the world we experience the world.
Right. Right.
And I think that's probably so. The biggest misconception for me is that people think that Stoics don't feel emotions, and it's not that. It's just that we feel emotions for sure, but we're able to feel them. We're able to process them. We're able to manage them ourselves and not put the blame for how we feel on anybody else. We can also look at things and say, this person is yelling, screaming at me, and we decide how we want to feel about that. One of my favorite life coaches says, nobody can make you feel anything without your permission.
Wow.
And, when I first heard that, I was like, what is she? Wait a second. And the more I thought about it from a Stoic perspective, I was like, yeah, that's absolutely right. Meaning if I came up to you and started yelling, something at you in German and you had no idea what I was saying, you wouldn't know whether to be upset or not. I could be saying the nicest things in the world, but saying them loudly and yelling in your face, but you wouldn't, because you didn't know about it. The only way that you would be able to form some kind of response would be the thoughts in your brain of going, well, is he saying something mean, or is he saying something nice? Is he saying something funny, or is he being mean? Should I feel threatened? It's all about our perspective on it and our perception of what's going on. And so Stoics recognize that if they allow this person to come in and poke at them and push their buttons and disturb their tranquility, that they've just given all this power away to somebody else. They've said, here, you have the power to rile me up. Whereas a Stoic just looks at it and goes, wow, look at this person. I mean, there's all this vibrations coming out of their mouth. I mean, when you think about it, that's all that's happening, is that we get upset over airwaves that are moving, are vibrations coming through the air from somebody else's mouth. Or we get upset because they, made markings on a page. And that's really what it is. So when you think about it at the very literal sense, which Stoics like to do, it's kind of that essentialism. Like you look at something for its the essential things. Are these scribbles on a page worth me getting that upset about? Are
Mhm.
these vibrations in the air worth me getting angry about and losing my shit over it? And for plenty of people, the answer is yes. They, because they don't think of it that way because of that lack of self-awareness. And so
Mhm.
I think, as a long-winded answer, yes, I think it is the whole trope of Stoics are very, they just very unemotional and everything like that. But it's the attribution of why they're that way and why they're able to manage their emotions better. And to me, what's 10 times more powerful is somebody who can step up, feel their emotions, can have, be right in the shit of something going on and, be in a really rough and tumble situation and still keep their cool and still be able to be like, you know what? I know what's going on here. I mean, I think of it like George Clooney. To me, he's like one of the coolest, the epitome of cool people,
Yeah.
because he has this persona, and and I'm sure he's like this in real life, is because most actors, what you see on screen is very similar to who they are, for the most part. Is he has this just ability that people can throw all kinds of shit at him. The situations can just go completely foobar, and he just kind of goes, "All right, well, what are we going to do about this?" There's never a screaming and yelling and it's your fault and you need to do this. It's the, okay, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to manage this? And there's just this factor of, it doesn't matter how upset I get, it's not going to help anything. What can I do to actually do something? And I think
Sure.
that's, so I think the long and the short is the attribution of why somebody is stoic, or what the term stoic means, is the misconception, not stoic, being
Sure.
stoic in and of itself.
That's fascinating too. And so I guess sort of reflecting on my own, kind of personal understandings of Stoicism, like I'll read it and I feel like I understand it on a theoretical, like intuitive level, but I also, just for fun, I play club rugby, just amateur level. And
Mm-hmm.
I find myself realizing some of the exact things you're saying. There's sometimes where you're playing this game and emotions are very high. Sometimes my own teammates are screaming at me, and my own initial reaction is almost to like, why are you, kind of that default reaction of getting upset because they're upset at me. But then it's like, can't take that stuff personally. And I think kind of seeing stoicism in that way has sort of allowed me to kind of take a step back in some of those intense emotional episode. So it's really cool to kind of hear you talk about that as well, because I think that's like 100% true. And yeah, I think that's a really cool way to sort of, conceptualize stoicism. Um, so you are very well read when it comes to stoicism. Like like every time there's episodes, you're dropping quotes from like Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, all these like big names. Some are maybe people have heard of, some not, which is really cool because it introduces me to more philosophers. But what I'm curious is, do you go outside of stoicism and do you read other schools of philosophy? Maybe it's like to compare, contrast. And if so, maybe which ones have you dabbled in, or maybe, or if you haven't, I guess not. But
Yeah, I would say probably the first one that really spoke to me, years ago, and this was even while I was still Mormon. And Mormons are very territorial, if you will. Like,
sure.
if you are Mormon, you are not supposed to read anything that's anti-Mormon or anything that might be witchcraft, or they have all these weird ideas about a lot of things like that. But I found that Buddhism actually was very interesting to me. And I think the reason why was because uh, I was initially kind of introduced to it through M. Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled, which
Ooh.
was probably one of the best books on psychology that I think has ever been written. Ironically enough, he actually ended up becoming an alcoholic. His success from being this great
Oh,
psychologist, kind of drove him into, yeah, all kinds of
oh yeah.
interesting and unhealthy behaviors. But one of the things that I really appreciated about the book, and took me years to recognize some of these things, was that he talks about in there that, um, in Buddhist philosophy, one of the first tenet of Buddhist philosophy is that life is suffering, that
Yep.
you're going to suffer. Life sucks. But the second tenet is, if you recognize that life sucks and you accept that life sucks, it doesn't suck as much because you just recognize, man, this is what's going to be in life.
Yeah.
And the next big thing is that suffering comes from attachment. And what they mean by attachment is that the Stoics would call it externals. You put your
Mhm.
value on things that are outside of yourself. You look for being fulfilled by things outside of yourself. You put your happiness on things outside of yourself. You put your happiness on your house or your car or your lover or your spouse or your children. That yes, while all of these things should bring you joy, they should be things that feed you joy, not the things you are dependent upon about that joy. And that comes
Right.
back to that whole idea of like, if you want the source of love for yourself and acceptance, then it doesn't matter how much is feeding into you, you're going to be empty. And Buddhism is very much the same way. When it talks about attachment, it means that you are placing your happiness on things that are outside of you. And that's exactly what Stoics do. So to me, Stoicism and Buddhism are basically the same thing, just a slightly different language. It's kind of like if you
Yeah.
understand German and you go and find Dutch, you're like, oh wow, this is okay. I can go into, it's they're so similar. They just use different words for some of the same, but very much the same concepts. The core teachings, I would say, are probably like 90% aligned. Uh, Buddhism is a little bit more woo-woo in a lot of ways, whereas Stoicism tries to be a bit more rational about things and try and use
Sure.
logic for those things. But the end result is pretty much the same. I mean, you find a good Zen master and he's just going to tell you, you're like, how do I make the world better? It's like, well, the world is perfect how it is. Okay, well, if it's perfect how it is, why would I want to grow and be better? That's up to you.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
and so it's that same thing of, like Stoics are like, well, just be happy with what you have in life. Well, if I'm totally happy with what I have in life, does that mean that I shouldn't try and be better? It's like, no, because that's part of what life is becoming greater than what you are.
yeah.
But the problem is that, and this is one of the problems that we have in our thinking, and I think a lot of it, people who listen to my podcast are pretty aware that I'm not a big fan of most religions.
Mm,
Um, I think that I think that with any school of thought, whether it's religious, philosophical, scientific, whatever it is, you need to be very self-aware. You need to be very conscientious and pull the things that work and be very skeptical of the things that don't. Never
yes.
accept something just because somebody said it, except hook, line, and sinker, which is how I was brought up. And I recognize that while there were some things about the Mormon church that I really appreciated, there were plenty of things that just didn't work for me. And it actually caused me a lot of stress and pain in my life. But I didn't understand that because it was told, this is the truth and the only truth, and you must accept this truth or you're going to hell. And so I'm like, okay, I'm accepting this truth, but I feel horrible about it. And I'm totally unhappy. So I think that being able to pick and choose and recognize what works for you and what doesn't is probably one of the most important things about that.
Yeah, I
So
totally agree. I love hearing you talk about meditation too, whether it's here on this pod right now or on your episodes, because that's sort of I discovered, Buddhism. I wouldn't necessarily call myself a Buddhist. I haven't been to a temple in quite some time, but I used to, study meditation at a temple, and I did my doctorate using meditation as an intervention in school. So I'm very pro meditation, and hearing you kind of connect the dots between stoicism and meditation, I think is like only open my eyes and kind of enhance my own meditation practice even more. It's kind of more focused on that sort of self-awareness you're talking about. So I think that's just absolutely cool to hear. Um, I want to now kind of switch gears just a little bit. I know you talked about this a moment ago when you were talking about sort of your podcast origin stories, creating the Stoic Coffee Break. So as you mentioned earlier, you recently took a break from the Stoic coffee break, personal issues you talked about just a moment ago, and also on your podcast. But I'm curious, now that you're back making content, making episodes weekly again, thank God you are. What has been the response like from your audience? Now that you're back, like has your audience how has your audience responded? Are you getting good feedback? Are you building up the same listenership, or how's that going for you?
actually pretty well. So at its peak, probably a year ago, I was probably doing double what the listens are now, but I mean, it dropped down to maybe like, you know, 10% for a while or
Oh wow.
8%. But I mean, there was still steady, excuse me, excuse me.
No worries.
You'll probably want to cut that.
Yeah,
Um,
it's all good. Easy to cut around.
trying to think about the best way to bring that back up. Yeah. So as far as, my listenership, it did drop for a while, obviously, when I was offline. But it seems to be coming back fairly well. And I would say probably in the next month or two, I'll probably hit back to where I was prior to when stopping. Uh, the nice thing about my content, and I've gotten this quite a bit, is that basically it's evergreen content. It's something that I've put out there that it's topical as far as it's on the topic, but it's not, you know, time related. You can listen to it at any time and it's fine. I do bring up some events here and there that have happened. Like there was one episode where I can't even remember when it was, but like I talked about Sarah Silverman, and people were like, because she did this really cool thing where this guy was trolling her and was just being a complete ass on Twitter. And rather than snapping back at him and being, just rude or anything like that,
Sure.
she went and did a little bit of research on him and found out that this guy was an ex-vet, and he was in a lot of pain. He had had some injuries serving in, I think, Iraq or Afghanistan, and was just in a lot of pain every single day. And so she put out to her Twitter followers and said, "Hey, you know, this guy's in a lot of pain. Is there anybody in his area that can help him out?"
Oh, wow.
And one of her listeners was a chiropractor, and it's like, totally right there with you. Let's see if we can get this guy in and take care of him, because it seems like the VA is not doing very well for him. And she sent him a note saying, "Hey, I see you're in a lot of pain. I'm really sorry to hear about that. And I want to, connected all these things for him." And the guy was just so ridiculously grateful and was like, "I'm sorry for the evil things that I said to you. I I totally misjudged you." And just like almost in tears,
Yeah.
basically saying thank you so much for your help. And so and while that's, yes, that was a moment in time, but it's not something that, you have to know about the specific instance, or anything like that. It's not anything that's dealing with, "Hey, this happened last week and you need to go check that out," like a lot of, political podcasts and things like that, because
Right.
politics is always changing. Um, so it's definitely getting back up, and I like a lot of things are actually moving faster than they were before. I created an Instagram account about a year ago, and I've done absolutely nothing to promote it. I just simply post links to my episodes. That's it. And occasionally I throw a thought or something on there, and I want to do more videos and everything like that, which is part of this whole drive this year to get more organized and disciplined. But, like with doing absolutely no promotion on it, I think I'm just over 1,000 people following me on there, and I'm like, okay, that's cool. And I'm sure there's plenty of tricks I could do to increase that, but I really appreciate the organic growth that's been happening with the podcast. And, like the reads on my website, before I get maybe, 200 or 300 reads in a week, and now I'm getting, 2,500 in a week,
Oh,
so
wow.
things are actually starting to pick up, and it's starting to, the rate of increase is moving up, and that's really great to see. Um, and for me, a lot of that it's encouraging, because I'm looking at reopening a community, which I tried that a year ago, but again, my life was kind of falling apart, and I was like, okay, I don't have the time or energy to put into a community. So I'm working on putting a community together and working on creating some courses about stoicism, and
Ooh.
hopefully get those out in the next 2 or 3 months. And so, yeah, but for me, I feel like I'm finally at that point where the confidence is there, and even though my ex-partner always talked about, it's like, look, yes, you may be failing at a lot of these things in your own personal life, but you're a great teacher. You're really good
Mm.
at teaching these things. You're good at that.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be the best example. You don't have to be a perfect example. But by recognizing and honoring the fact that you make these mistakes and you talk about those, that's actually being a great example. And
Yes.
so you don't have to be perfect to do this. And it's taken me a while to get to that point where I'm like, okay, I actually believe you, even though, yes, you are really smart. And I know you're really smart about these things, but yeah, I mean, it takes time to
Yeah.
it takes time to get out of your own way so you can actually get shit done.
Sure, sure. And I actually think it's so, yeah, I love hearing you talk about this because I thought, that episode where you came back and you opened up kind of about, maybe just some of the anxiety about, oh, I'm talking about stoicism, but not living the best life and all those things. I thought that was so, just kind of being vulnerable that way is like, that made me appreciate your show even more. And I just thought that was really cool. And also it's cool to hear you talk about like seeing kind of the traffic, whether it's to your website or your podcast increase, because that's something I watch as well on my own show and watching it grow, not necessarily because I'm wanting to see the numbers go up for whatever, monetary reasons or anything like that, but just simply knowing that there's connections happening. Because I think that's sort of what podcasting is all about. Like, sure, I can sit around and talk into a mic and hear myself do it all day, but as long as I'm making connections with people listening or people like you coming on my show, like I don't really care who listens as long as I just keep making connections. So I'm happy. I'm so happy to hear things are going well, and I hope my listeners right now can hear this. If you're not aware, another reason to listen to Eric's podcast, he has one of the most soothing voices when it comes to a podcast. So if that alone should bring you to the table, then the stoicism is great too. But it's just a great audio for me whenever I listen to his show. So I want to talk specifically about the title of your podcast. It's one of the things that really intrigued me when I think I went onto Spotify and looked up stoicism or stoic, maybe even just like what's out there. I have no idea when I was looking for stuff on stoicism. And I immediately caught my eye. Your show caught my eye because it not only mentioned stoicism, but it talked about coffee. And you said, hey, this is a show that you can listen to while over a cup of coffee. So I love this show. You've got it seems like it's inspired by coffee. It's centered around coffee to some extent, So I'm just curious, are you a coffee drinker? Do you have a favorite blend or roast of coffee? I'm currently drinking a cup of Gavalia dark roast. They're not a sponsor, but my gosh, if they wanted to be, I would plug their stuff all day.
Yeah. So the way that came about, kind of two things. I originally titled the podcast Stoic Meditations, but then I think there were like three or four other Stoic meditation podcasts out there.
Yeah, yeah.
The most famous being there's an Italian professor, Magnolio Pugilio, I think is his name. I'm totally butchering his name, but he has one called Stoic Meditations, and he's like a professor in Italy and of classic studies, and really great guy. And so I was like, well, I don't want to be competing directly with him, and so I went on a domain hosting website. And I was like, okay, Stoic, and what kind of domains are out there? And I saw Stoic Coffee, and I was, and there was like Stoic.life, all these other ones. And I was just like, Stoic Coffee, that actually sounds really good. Plus, given that I'm, now no longer Mormon, it's kind of like, giving a finger. So I'm like, okay, it's my way of rebelling against that. And yes, I do drink plenty of coffee. I'm not particular about any particular brand, which is kind of the funny thing. There's this one, it's a Hawaiian blend that I really, really like. It's Kauai something. It's a blue bag, and I'm totally blanking on the name, but they have one. It's like a coconut caramel crunch, which I absolutely love. Then I buy these other ones that are from a company in Idaho, believe it or not, but they have these great flavors in there that I really enjoy. And so I'm not a coffee snob by any means. For a medium roast, but Javelia is wonderful. And
I butchered
one
it.
of the
I'm
things
sorry.
no, Javelia is wonderful. I really I've been to Burning Man 5 years in a row, or 5 years. I went 5 years in a row. And one of the things we would do is we found these Javelia almond milk coffee things, and I'm lactose intolerant, and they were these, the box, coffee in a box kind of things, and they were so ridiculously yummy, and you could drink them cold. And so we would take those, and they would be our coffee down at Burning Man. So we didn't actually have to brew coffee; we could just do that. And then the stores around here stopped carrying them, and we were so frustrated. These big yellow things. I loved that stuff. So when you said Javelia, I'm like, oh yeah, their prefab coffee like that was just absolutely delicious. But I found that, there's a lot of great imagery with that. It's, coffee, as we see in our culture, it's kind of like gets you started and all of this kind of stuff. But it's also oftentimes coffee shops are a great place, just to go chill out, in a place to kind of read a book and kind of reflect on things. So for me, it just kind of as a brand fit, if you will, from looking at it branding way, it just really fit because it just kind of was a nice, all the images they kind of came up with, coffee and coffee shops and stuff like that just kind of seemed to work, of like sitting around and taking your time to think about things and enjoying things. So yeah,
Excellent.
so that's kind of where it came from.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I love to hear that. I need to be more I need to be more upfront when the title of this podcast is Knowledge Brews Supreme, of course. But sometimes people will ask me, "Are you referring to brewing beer?" And I'm like, "No, it's brewing coffee. I got beer every now and then, it's fine, but no, give me a cup of coffee all day. I'll take that all day." So, uh,
Yeah.
love to hear that. So, now I want to kind of switch gears because not only you have most of your podcast episodes are speaking into the mic about a topic of stoicism. Maybe it's something you're thinking about or something you're wanting to share. But you also have episodes where you're interviewing. You bring guests on. I've noticed you've been having more of those episodes, which I think is really cool. Do you have maybe like a bucket list guest for your show? Is there like a current philosopher of stoicism, or somebody, or maybe not just one philosopher, but are there people maybe you're really wanting to bring on and chat with about stoicism, maybe that you haven't done so yet?
Um, yeah, I mean, honestly, kind of going back to the Ursprung, the original for me would honestly be Tim Ferriss.
Oh
Sitting
yeah.
down and talking with Tim and just chatting with him. What I like about Tim is he's very smart, but he's also very humble. He tries to understand his limits. He's willing to push himself. He's willing to own his weirdness and his mistakes. Um, and he just seems like he's a pretty decent guy. And he was the reason why I got into Stoicism in the first place. I did get to tell him that one time I went up to a
Oh,
conference in Seattle for Creative Live, which is Chase Jarvis's thing. And he and Chase are super close friends. And part of this, it was like a podcast week. And I'd just been working for another company and this popped up. And so I was just like, hey, well, this is my vacation, So I got to go hang out in Seattle for a week and attend all these podcast things. They had from people from, all kinds of people like Alex Bloomberg, I think, gave a talk on storytelling. I mean, just all these really things. It was both virtual and people showing up. And so they did a virtual one with Tim, and Chase interviewed him for his podcast. And we got to ask questions. So I got to like get up there and totally fanboy over Tim, going, "Oh my gosh, Tim, I want to tell you this." So I was just like, "Hey, you were the reason why I started this podcast. I really, really appreciate it. And this is what I've done." And and I think at the time I maybe had like 20,000 or 30,000 downloads. And so at the time that I was like, wow, this is getting really big. And, I look back at that now, I'm like, 20,000 downloads. That's like, I mean, I get more than that a week, So I
Wow.
get that, in 2 days, I have more than 20,000 downloads. So it's just funny now that at the time, 20,000 downloads was huge for me. I think that I remember watching my stats. I think by episode like 40, I had like 5,000 downloads, and I was just like, oh my God, 5,000 people downloaded my podcast. 5,000. Whoa, that's crazy. Um, now I think it's like over 6 million or something like that.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and it's, I would like to get to the point where I have, it would be awesome if I had like 1 million a month or something like that, but that's going to take a while to get there. But I think before I just put it out and just hoped that it would take off on its own. And now I'm actually more actively looking at ways to promote that. And part of that is bringing people on the show, but part of it is I just want to get different perspectives on things.
Sure.
And for me, while yes, it's great you're hearing my perspective on this, and I appreciate, I get plenty of compliments of people saying, "Hey, I really appreciate your perspective on these things." I'm just one person. And for me, I need to expand the way that I think about things and having different people on there to not just, you know, confirm what I already know, but to help open insights for me. And that's, I think, one of my biggest drivers is that I'm not content on just knowing what I know and regurgitating what I know, but taking what I've learned and doing my best to stretch that out even further. So I really appreciate being able to talk and with other people on that about that. So I think Tim would definitely be a big one. Another one for me would be Brooke Castillo. She's a life coach. She teaches
Oh,
the life coach
cool.
school, and her I mean, her podcast is called the Life Coach School, and basically she has a school where she coaches, she has life coaches and so on. Um, but she drops all kinds of just massively important lessons, very similar to me. And a lot of her ideas are basically just stoicism packaged up in a very modern format.
Oh,
And
cool.
so I really appreciate a lot of what she does. And so I I find that when I'm struggling with things in my life, that I will, go for a walk and pop on one of her episodes, and it really definitely kind of resets the gears. But what I love is that she is incredibly transparent about who she is, and transparent about what she's trying to do with her life. She tells you that, hey, we almost made $50 million last year with my school, and I'm this year I'm going for 100. And people are like, oh, how can you be so brazen about that? She's like, look, because I'm doing my best to add as much value back into the world so that I'm worth $100 million for a number of reasons, because that stretches me to become more valuable to the world.
Yeah.
Because I have to be, what I did to make 50 million was great, but what I have to do to make 100 million is put even more value out into the world. And part of that, making that 100 million, is helping other people put more value back out into the world. And so I really appreciate her point of view on things. So she would be phenomenal to chat with. Trying to think who else. I mean, they're just. I mean, I'm sure there's probably a pretty big list, but right now I've just been, picking people that I know that I find that I really learn a lot. So, like, the last one I put out was with my friend Trevor, and Trevor contacted me on LinkedIn about a year and a half ago, and talked about, he used Stoic principles in his company, and he just lives 4 hours south of me.
Oh, nice.
So I've gone down, had lunch with him and stuff before. Plus he's in software, so we can talk shop on that. But he's just a really, really interesting guy, and it was really fun chatting with him because he's really good about applying stoicism in a lot of ways. He has a lot of self-discipline on things, but then he talks about, he's like, and then my 11-year-old can just go bing and push that button, and he's like, and so that's been my Achilles heel that I've had to work on. And I'm like, that's so fascinating, because like for me, my kids were super easy, and a lot of it was because growing up, I was incredibly mindful about how I wanted, if I ever had kids, how I wanted to raise them, because my growing up was so terrible. And I was
Mm.
like, so I had a pretty strong idea of like, at least I'm not going to do these things. And so I worked really hard to try and be a good father. But my personal relationships, I didn't really have a clue on how to manage those things very well. But he and his wife have a very strong relationship and don't seem to have these issues that I run into in personal relationships. So it's fascinating to see how we're both very intelligent people, but coming at these problems, you know, that's my Achilles, and that's what I've had to really work on. Whereas him being the father and being patient and not letting the kid get under his skin is, one of his little Achilles heels things. And so for me, it's just fascinating to see people who are incredibly successful at some things, just have this giant weakness, and that's great, because I want other people out there to notice that I'm not perfect when I talk about these things. I make so many mistakes and mess up so many things in my life. The one thing that I am is I'm pretty tenacious, is that I recognized at a young age that I wasn't very happy, and that I could learn how to be happy because I had friends who were genuinely happy. They weren't putting on that fake, like, look, I'm so happy. I'm so, whereas I
Yeah.
felt like if I were trying to be like them, I would have to fake it. Whereas they were just genuinely happy. And I was like, okay, there's something I'm missing in this life, and I got to figure this out. And Stoicism finally given me a lot of that. And because it teaches you how your brain works, it teaches you
Yes.
that you are in control of your thoughts and your perspectives. And because of that, you are in control of your happiness. But that you shouldn't go out and try to be happy. What you do is you try to go out and do good work, try to be a good person, try to, be busy doing the things to just make a good life. And then happiness is a byproduct. You can't
Mm.
make yourself
Yes.
happy. There was an episode I had called The Unpursuit of Happiness. Like, stop trying to be happy, try to
Yeah.
be useful, try to be valuable, try to do good things in the world, and
Yes.
happiness will just come.
Yes.
Um, so I don't know if you know, the etymology of happiness comes from happenstance, and happenstance means lucky circumstances.
Yeah. Yes.
It's just, that's where it comes from. And so we like to think, oh, we should go out and be happy, and it's like, well, you can't be happy. You're happy because things just happen to come aligned that way.
Right.
And so stop trying to be happy with your life. Just try and live a good life, and then happiness will come. And there's plenty of times where it won't. I mean, life is 50-50. You're going to have shit, you're going to have greatness, and you can't have one without the other. And we keep wanting to have the one and ignore the other. And the problem is, when you ignore the other, that's where that and taking on the other, taking on the darkness and going, yeah, you know what? I'm sitting in this shit and this really sucks right now, but I can sit with this and I can live with this and I can be good with this. And if I can be okay when my life is falling apart and I feel like the world is chaotic, but I'm still okay. Okay, then I can probably be happy just about anywhere.
Yes.
But if you're so delicate about your happiness that all these things have to align, then you're not really talking about happiness. You're talking about comfort. You're
Yeah.
talking about pleasure. You should be able to be okay and be okay with who you are in any circumstance. And that's what Stoicism is all about, is the idea that understanding that happiness is really just a perspective on things.
And yeah, I'm so happy you brought. I can't. I just used that word too. Okay, that's a little weird, a little ironic, but I'm so
Yep.
fascinated you brought that up because I my PhD is in educational psychology. Studied a lot of just typical psychology before that. Read Buddhism, now reading Stoicism. And I think those kind of three perspectives have really helped me see that yes, happiness is a good thing, but maybe as an individual or even collectively, we should value things like contentment more than just pure happiness because if you're able to be, like you said, comfortable or happy in any situation, if you can be content where you are, no matter what's going on, the happiness will come. Just let it. It'll do its own. It'll do itself. You don't have to worry about it anymore. And I think that's a hard lesson for people to figure out. I think it's one I'm still working through, but kind of hearing you talk about it, in those ways is resonating with me right now, at least personally. So I want to follow up on this with the last question, sort of a related question. There are so many wonderful scholars, philosophers when it comes to Stoic philosophy. You share wonderful quotes, I think, that really kind of help tie some of your larger points together in your episodes, like whether it's Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, or modern, Stoic philosophers. So I'm curious, if you could bring one and only one, you got to pick one. If you could bring any Stoic philosopher from any time period, whether they're dead or alive, who would you go with? Are you going to go with Marcus Aurelius, or are you going with somebody else? Like, and why? Why for your pick?
Um, wow, that's a tough one. I think I guess I'm going to rank them, but
That's fine. That's cool. But your number one would be your first pick, I would assume.
yeah. So kind of starting from the lower, I think Marcus Aurelius would be fascinating just because here was a man who was kind of uncorruptible. He,
Yes.
he was so powerful. I mean, he could have had anything he wanted. He could have been Caligula if he wanted to, and he wasn't. So I find him as just a fascinating example of how to find that balance and live a life like that. Next up, probably number two spot would be Epictetus, just because I mean, in a way, he's kind of grumpy, but I appreciate just his frankness and his clarity of
Mm.
things. Um, and I would say he's probably my favorite, just straight up Stoic philosopher. But I think as I'm starting to understand a bit more, at least, and this is very, how would you say it? In the moment, because I mean, I think we always have favorites and they always flux. It's like my
Right.
favorite song this week is this, my favorite song next week is this other one, and that's okay.
Exactly.
But more recently, I've just been really fascinated by Socrates, or Socrates, if you're saying the Greek. And the reason why is not necessarily because of what Socrates taught, or that he had these phenomenal ideas. Where Stoicism for me was, here's a lot of these principles that, like Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca teach us, which have been exceptionally helpful for me. And they were the things that I was able to take and ground myself and kind of have some foundation built. So I think Stoicism was that great foundation. But what I loved about Socrates, and part of this was inspired, believe it or not, I was playing Assassin's Creed, the one that's Odyssey, which is set in ancient Greece, and they
Yeah.
have a character of Socrates in there, or Socrates as they call him, and whoever does the acting and wrote the script and everything just does a phenomenal job of really doing a great job, because Socrates really makes you question everything in such a powerful way. He doesn't say this is what is. He says, oh, really? Are you sure that's what is? Let's think about this. How can we question things in a way so that we can understand? And there's never any definitives. It's all about questioning your perspective. And so it's kind of the meta version, or the metacognition version, of a lot of the Stoic ideals. And obviously he was before the Stoics. The Stoics were highly inspired by him. But his ability to really step up and question himself, question his reality, question everything in such a way. It's such an incredibly powerful tool. It's not just like a doctrine or a dogma where he says, here's A, B, C, D, and E. And if you do A, B, C, D, and E, you're happy with life, which is what religions to me are. That religions are very prescriptive. They're just, here's the thing you do. If you do these, you will be happy. And I found that growing up in a religion that was very dogmatic like that, I did all of these things and I wasn't happy. I
Right.
followed exactly the way they said. And I just was like, yeah, that's great that you think that, but I'm still doing all of these things and I'm still very unhappy because you're not, it's all performative. It's all of these surface layer things. Am I dressed the right way? Am I, did I, do I have the right beard? I mean, whatever it is that you
Yeah.
have, it's all about these performative things. It's never about what's really going on down deep because you have, I mean, I grew up in Salt Lake and it's very much about the look of things. So
Mhm.
by all looks, my family was a good Mormon family. Everything was fine. Everything was great. We had three, there were four kids in the family and two parents, and they were married after 25 years, all these things. But if you had been on the inside, you would have seen, here's my dad who was, latent bisexual. I mean, the reason my parents got divorced is because my dad was having sex with men on the side.
Oh, wow.
And I finally told my mom. My mom was just like, okay, I can't do this anymore.
Right.
And and I'm sure that I'm not very close with many members of the family on my dad's side anymore. He died in 96.
Right.
But um for a long time he was so scared of that. He was so ashamed of that. And he did not want anybody to know about that because that would conflict with his public persona that he had to create. And he was terrified. My mom was going to tell everybody. My mom was like, that's your garbage. It's not my secret to share,
Right.
and I share it simply because I recognize now that people need to understand that there are people who are caught in this culture that is so damaging, and I want them to know that you're not alone. You're pretty normal. I mean, if that's part of who you are, own up to who you are and just be that person. If my dad had just been a happy person but had been in a relationship with a man but had been happy, I would have been totally on board with that. I would have been like, oh my God, my dad's happy. He's a great dad. I love being around him because he's such a
Yeah.
happy person.
Yeah.
And and in many ways, he was a great guy. There were so many great things about him. Um,
Sure.
Sorry, I kind of got off topic right there.
Oh, I love it. It's
Uh,
great.
but I find that anything that is too prescriptive and just says, hey, this is how you have to live your life, I'm incredibly suspect of that,
Yep.
which is why I appreciate Socrates, which is why I like a lot of the kind of Zen masters and a lot of the Zen philosophy. It's not about telling you this is how to live, but it's teaching you how to question things.
Mhm.
Alan Watts teaches you to think. He's like, did you think about it this way? Or what questions could you ask about this?
Yes.
Um, and so it's very much about, I mean, but even Socrates, he still had his principles. Here are the principles you need to understand. And then once you understand those and have that foundation, that bedrock, then you can start to ask the hard questions. Then you can start improvising on these things. A great book that kind of fills some of those things in for me in a very different way is called The Way and the Power. And it's
Ooh.
a book about Japanese swordsmanship. And it's all about understanding Japanese swordsmanship from a kind of a meta way of looking at it. And I heard about it from Tim Ferriss had a podcast. And I can't remember the guy's name. He was a retired basketball player, brilliant player. And I just, I don't care much about sports at all for the most part. I did try and play rugby for a little bit at one point,
What'd
but
you hold on? Hold on. What position you got it? If I'm talking any former rugby play, what'd you play? What'd you get to into?
I only, I only went to like four practices because it took me an hour and a half to get there all the time. So it was more of just I went out and I tried playing, and then it was like, you know
Sure.
what, I've got a kid at home. It's just taking up too much time. So
Okay. Fair
I
enough.
didn't even
Yeah.
remember all the positions. But I had played soccer in high school and wrestled, and so I always thought that soccer before high school, but wrestled in high school, and so I always thought that'd be fun.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but anyway, so I'm just not a huge sports person per se, but I really appreciate his perspective on things. He's a very, very smart guy, and I wish I could remember his name. But he recommended this book. Tim's like, "What are you reading now?" He's like, "This book, The Way and the Power," and I was just like, "That sounds fascinating." And it's to me, it's one of those books. It's a meta book. It's one of those things where it doesn't just teach you something. It doesn't teach you hacks. Doesn't teach you these things. It changes how you think.
Oh,
And
wow.
for me, I really like things that change how you think.
Yes.
Another one along those lines is Finite and Infinite Games by James Karst. It it's only about 100 pages long, but it is one of these books that changes the way that you view the world. It changes how you think about how people interact with each other. Another one along those lines is Gödel Escher Bach by uh, I can't remember his name now, I'm blanking on his name, but another one. It's one of these books that it's about it's about metacognition. It's about thinking, like how we think, and it talks about the structure of language and music and other things like that. And so I find that Socrates is kind of that way as well. It's not about how well can you regurgitate these principles, but it's how well can you question your reality and the world around you. And that for me is much more fascinating. I'm starting to kind of branch off into those ideas. But I still come back to these core things of Stoicism because those are the bedrock. Those are the things that give me that foundation to be able to play off of. Kind of like you can't get up and perform on the stage if you haven't built the stage.
Right.
Stoicism is the
Right.
stage that it's the support, it's the foundation that allows you to get up and go, okay, because I can understand these basic principles, I understand that my reality is created by my perspective. Now I can start questioning my perspective. What if I thought about it this way? What if I thought about it in that way?
Mm.
This person thinks about this thing in that way. What if I decided that I wanted to think like them? I mean, my episode last week was very much about it was the idea of what would happen rather than making incremental changes in your life, of just becoming a little bit better person at what all these things are you do, which is incredibly important
Sure.
because those are the daily things that get you there. That's the consistency, and you need to have that. And while you need to get a little bit better at certain things, but what if you decided in some ways just to completely change who you were as a person, that you changed your identity? And how would you do something like that? Is by adopting a completely different perspective on things. I mean, what if one day you woke up and you decided you wanted to imagine what it would be like to be George Clooney? I mean, I used him earlier in
Yeah.
there because
Yeah.
George Clooney he's a very interesting guy, and I if you ever watch him, he is just one of the most confident people you could ever meet.
Oh,
But he's
yeah.
also very humble. He's also he doesn't blow his own horn about things. He seems just super comfortable in his own skin. Like he just seems like one of the coolest people around. But he has a very interesting perspective on things. And so it was like, what would happen if you were to adopt somebody's mindset so completely that you could see the world through their eyes? And
Yes.
so that was kind of the crux of the episode is think about the kind of person you want to be in the future, and if that's, if you have a role model of doing that, and write a biography of what that person is like. How do they think about the world
Mm.
when they get up in the morning? How do they brush their teeth? I mean, I know it's silly, but
Yeah. Yeah.
would they use an electric toothbrush versus a regular one? Think about how they would view the world. And if you can start to see the world from their perspective, you can change your whole world.
I love that.
And
I love that.
and I think that that's where you can get that kind of massive change. And so I think that while you need these ideas and stoicism to help kind of keep the equanimity, that balance in your life, and to help you to accept that life is just going to throw everything at you, and you just kind of have to accept that, because the other the other alternative of not accepting reality is to deny reality. And then
Yes.
it's going to make it very challenging to deal with what's happening if you're not acknowledging this is what's happening. And so for me, I'm kind of reaching that point of, because I've talked about these things and worked through these things for so long, now that next step is, how do I start to shift who I am as a person in a very fundamental way? And like, for example, and this is where you can focus on very specific things too. And this is where I talked about earlier in this, and I've talked about in a number of episodes, that one of the biggest things that I learned over this last year is that I needed to be my own source of love.
Mm.
So who is somebody that I know that loves themselves in a way that I appreciate?
Oh,
How
wow.
could I start treating myself that way? How could I be that kind of loving person towards myself? And so I thought about people that I knew that I considered very loving and compassionate people, um, or at least people that did a really good job of being able to map out their boundaries well enough to go, this is who I am, and I respect and love who I am, and I care for who I am, in a way that I found um, just in a very sustainable and supportive, not in an egotistical sort of way, like I'm the greatest thing that ever happened. I mean, people who are braggarts just annoy the crap out of me because it's just like, yeah, whatever. If they're bragging in a very humble and just honest way, like, yeah, this is who I am, this is what I'm good at, I have no problem with that. You know, if somebody is an amazing pianist, or like if Yo-Yo Ma talks about cello and he says, well, I'm really good at because I do these things, I'm not going to go, oh, he's so egotistical. I'm like, this guy's a fucking master,
Yes.
you know. But if you ask Yo-Yo Ma, hey, do you have room for improvement? He'll say, yes, I do. I
Yes.
absolutely do. I'm a great cello player, but I could be even better. And he knows that. And because
Yes.
he's willing to recognize that he could be better, that gives him that hunger. He can accept that he's amazing, but he can also accept that he can be better. So the same idea is that learning to love yourself and learning to be that way is probably one of the most important things that I learned this last year. And that's a radical shift. And so I had to shift who I was as a person, as being, I am a loving person. I am somebody who is really good at loving myself and loving other people. And so how do I practice being good at loving other people? Well, I practice loving myself.
It
And it's
starts
not
there.
about yeah, and it's not about thinking I'm the greatest person in the world. It's just about accepting me for exactly who I am,
Yeah.
because I'm not going to be perfect, and that's okay. But for a long time, I was just like, oh my God, I'm such a terrible person. And it was just like, I would make a mistake, I get angry about something, and then I just beat myself up. And it just, it would spiral down. And it was just like, this isn't doing me any good. This is just digging me back into that hole that I just climbed out of. I just dug myself back in. So first thing was to stop digging that hole. So when I make a mistake, I don't beat myself up over it. I own it and go, you know what? I really screwed up on that. And I don't like the way that I did that. How could I be better about this? And okay, Eric, you love yourself. And and so working on that has been a big thing. But I had to shift my identity. I had to shift that I was a very loving and kind and caring person.
Hmm.
And so I act like a person who tries to be loving and very kind. And so, like I was saying earlier, that friend of mine who texted me earlier this week, you made me so angry and I'm so mad because of what you did that I want to cry. I wasn't mad. I wasn't like, yo, we shouldn't do that. I was just like, wow, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry that you're really struggling with this. And I just want you to know that I still love you. I still care for you no matter what. And I'm sorry to see you in so much pain.
Wow.
And that was just, there wasn't much I could do because they're at an emotionally immature level that I couldn't explain things from a stoic perspective. It just wouldn't have made sense to them. And I tried a little bit. I tried to say, well, this is how I see things. And they're
Yeah.
just like, I don't understand a thing that you just said. That makes absolutely no sense and it's dumb. And I was just like,
Oh
okay.
no.
And I was just like, okay. And I tried and I let them, I wrote back and I just said, by the way, I want you to know, I think you're an amazing person. These are the things that I adore about you and I love you. I also see that you're in a lot of pain. And I'm always here to listen to you, no matter what. Whenever you want to talk, I am 100% there for you because that to me is what a loving person would do. And so I was stepping up and going, hey, I am a loving person. That's part of my identity now. I'm a loving person. So I'm going to love you, even though these things you said felt kind of hurtful and I could have taken them that way. But I recognize that they come from a place of pain and not from a place of,
It's
you're
not
just in pain right
perfect.
now. And yeah, it's not well, I mean, for them, it was personal, but I was just
Yeah.
like, you know what?
Yeah.
I'm sorry that you're in this much pain, and I will do whatever I can whenever you're ready, but that's got to be something that you got to be ready for it.
Right. Right. Wow, that's so cool to hear. That's a fantastic, just kind of tying all that together. So I just have a few more questions. They're not necessarily so much about stoicism, but these are some of the questions I like to ask all of my guests. So I want to run a few of these past you. The first
Mhm.
one is pretty open-ended, and I'm extremely curious how you answered this question. And I bring all sorts of creative folks on my show. I mean, the whole point of this is just kind of tapping into that motivation behind people's creative outputs, whether it's podcasting, music, whatever. And you happen to occupy multiple spaces. You're a musician, podcaster, stoic philosopher. You write for your website, you make lots of content. So I'm curious, as a podcaster, when do you feel the most creative? Like, and when I ask this, what I mean is like, is there a particular moment, whether it's like when you're editing the episodes or whether you're coming up with topics or you're thinking about who do I want to come on the show? Is there a moment where you just feel like, oh yeah, I'm feeling like everything's clicking, the creativity is flowing. I'm going to make a really good episode. Or where do you find yourself kind of at that maybe flow state? I don't know how you want to describe it. I'm in psychology, so I think about flow states, but when do
Mhm.
you feel the most creative?
Wow. Let's see. I mean, I think I'm getting better about just creating them. Um, there was a great quote that I heard once where a reporter asked Somerset Maugham, who's uh, a writer, and I've never read anything by him, but I just love this quote by him, which is why I remembered it. Um, where the reporter asked him, was like, "Do you believe that the do you believe in creativity? Do you believe in the creative spark that it happens, or do you just or are you much more regimented and you just believe that you just have to sit down and just do it and make yourself do it?" And he was just like, "Well, I believe you know." I believe, I need to be inspired to do this. Luckily for me, I'm inspired every morning when I sit down and start typing at 9 o'clock every single morning. And that was his way of saying, yes, the creative spark is there, but the only way you're going to get the creative spark is to sit down and do the work.
Yes.
And Stephen King's the same way. He every day he gets up and he writes 10 pages. It's just 10 pages, no matter what. Even if they absolutely suck, you just get up there and you write the 10 pages. And for me, some days are better than others. Like last week's episode, I had written half of another episode, didn't like it.
Mm.
And this was probably about 8:30 Sunday night. I was like, this is not coming together. And so I kept getting distracted doing other things. So I grabbed my iPad and went upstairs, sat in the kitchen, and just wrote on my iPad because I only have one screen. And so it was really hard to do anything else. I use
Yeah.
Scrivener as my writing tool because the autocorrect on it is probably one of the better ones. And so it's super fast. And so I really it helps keep my flow going a lot faster because I don't have to worry about, oh, wait, no, this word is this. It does the autocorrect so much quicker on it. And so I can really kind of start flying on it. And plus it's just, I know the interface really well. I like how it looks. Um, so I started writing there and wrote for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, I think. Um, and then next thing I know, I had like almost 1,800 words right there. Whereas I almost started from blank slate right there. I think I'd had, just a page that I created, which was about it. And that was it. And then, but it was like 11 o'clock at night. I'm like, okay, I'm just too tired. I'm not gonna be able to do this. I was supposed to go out the next night. So I'm like, well, I guess this will be a Tuesday night thing. And then the person I was supposed to go out with on Monday night got a migraine. They're like, hey, we're gonna have to just reschedule this. I'm like, okay, fine, works for me. And so then I sat down and did a bunch of editing. It still took me another 3 or 4 hours to do it because I had almost, by the time I got done, I almost had 2,500 words. So it took some editing, threw out a whole bunch of stuff on it, and then recorded the podcast. Even then, it was still like 10:30 that night when I got it done because it was just one of those marathon episodes, which took a bit more. Um, so it's kind of all over the place. Sometimes I will have half an episode written before I start. Sometimes it takes me 2 hours and I can just nail it down. Other times it'll take me 6 to 8 hours to get it done. So it's just, I wish it were more consistent, but the only consistent is just being consistent and getting out there and doing it.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
the other thing is just that I found that I think my quality of episodes has gone up dramatically over this last year, simply because I've been doing it for so long, and because I've got what 240 some odd episodes now.
You've got a lot of reps. You've got a lot
Yeah.
of, experience there. So
So that's really helpful. I find that I'm able to speak on microphones so much better than I used to. There are very few ums, very few so's. Even and I'm getting better when I do interviews now. There's a lot less of those as well. I'm better at just sitting down and writing things down. And it's also starting to show up in other areas. So at the beginning of the year, I decided that, part of my New Year's resolution, I was going through a whole bunch of different things I wanted to get better about this year. And while I'm a musician, I'm self-taught. I taught myself how to play piano, and I play by ear very, very well. Uh, I had a few music lessons when I was about 6 or 7 on piano for like 2 months or something, and that was about it. Then, but I knew enough where I could read some notes but I would just listen to songs and I sit down and play them, and I was just like, okay, I want to. That's kind of how it worked. And then I took a music theory class and went, oh, so this is what I've been doing this whole time. And I was in choir. I was in choir, so I could read music okay, but I wasn't great at reading music. But I understand chord structures and I can read a chord sheet. If I've heard the song, I can probably pick it out pretty well. If I've heard the song and I have a chord sheet, I can pretty much come up with a nice arrangement for you. But I was like, I still suck at sight reading. So since the beginning of the year, I've been working on a song from the musical Chess, which I loved musicals when I was in high school and college and stuff. And I've just been sitting down and playing that for at least half an hour every single day and just learning the actual rote part and working on that. And I've been doing that since the beginning of the year, and it's really coming along. And so what I'm working on now is trying to fit more formal practices into my life and
Yes.
to put a bit more structure into those kind of things. And with my podcast, I'm starting to do that a little bit more too. I'm working on trying to create kind of a general structure of what each episode should be. I had that for a while and I was doing pretty well with it. And then it kind of, fell by the wayside just because I got pretty comfortable with it. And now I'm kind of working on trying to reintroduce that a little bit and come up with some basic, just some basic formats of this is how it's going to be. Like, I'm sure you've noticed there's some commonalities. The first thing is I ask a question or two at the beginning of it and I say, have you ever, or do you think about this? Well, today I want to talk about this idea and see if, and explore it a little bit deeper. And then I usually have a quote or two to start off with and then start discussing the topic, a little bit more in depth, try and give some examples of, hey, this is where you might run into this in your real life. Now that we've discussed this is the core thing, here's some examples. What can you do about it? What are some things you can do? And then try and give some practical steps. So I think that's kind of my outline of how I structure every episode, because I want people to walk away with having thought about it, having understood what the real problem is, and then understanding ways they can actually do something about it. But what's fascinating for me is I love to take an idea and see if I can flip it on its head and say, well, what if the opposite is true?
Oh,
This is
wow.
what I thought. What if the opposite, or maybe not the exact opposite, but what if I looked at it from a different perspective? What if I thought about it, from a side angle, or what if I flipped it on its head and said, what if, could the opposite be true? Because I think that far too often we believe everything we think. We
So true.
think because we had that thought, it must be true. And
Yes.
so if we and so to make sure that we don't do that, that we don't fall into our own, excuse me, our own, I guess the best way to put it, one of my favorite quotes by Lorena McKenna, when, do you know who she is?
I'm not familiar. I'm not.
She's a Celtic musician, and
Okay. Okay.
she for years, like she like made her own cassette tapes when she was first starting out, and then she made her own CDs, and she ran her own publishing company for all of her records and stuff like that. And then finally, when she got big enough, she went to Warner Brothers and said, hey, I sell 100,000 a year, let's work out a deal. And so one of her first songs actually got on and got radio play, and she was suddenly, all these people like, oh my god, she's amazing. And she's like, yeah, I've been doing this for 12 years now, and she already had 4 albums out before the song came out. And I remember there was an interview with her, and I can't remember the exact word of it. She's like, yeah. And they were like, isn't this so great, you're having all this success? And she's just kind of smiling. She's just like, well, there's one thing that I've learned in my career. It's like, well, all these great things are being said about you and everything. It's like, yeah, I know. But there's one thing I've learned in my career is don't believe any bullshit. Don't believe the bullshit that everybody says about you, because there's going to be good, there's going to be bad, there's going to be praise, there's going to be stuff coming about you. But she's like, just, I'm still the same person that I was yesterday before my song became this big hit. So she's like, I'm still going to do the work. I'm still going to get out there and do that. And I think that, God, I kind of lost track of where I was going with that. But I think that what I like I say, and what I try and do in my podcast is to give people some ways to think about things differently and not just accept things at face value, but to see if the opposite might be true, or to see if there's a better way of looking at it that can be more useful than what we consider conventional wisdom. And I think that that's really what I'm trying to do in my episodes is question, like as they say in Westworld, have you ever questioned questioned your reality? Are
Yeah.
you doing that on a daily basis? Are you questioning, could it be like this? Could it be like that? Because when you start doing that, you may find that even if your reality is X, looking at it from perspective Y might just be a better perspective to look at it because you're able to move through things a little bit easier.
I dig that. I like that. I really think, yeah, that big emphasis on putting in the work. I kind of think it's sort of what we were talking about with happiness earlier. It's like if you just do it, get into the habit, get into some consistency, I think sort of the rest of that stuff, the creativity, that stuff kind of starts to fall in place. But like you said, it's that stage, if you're missing the stage, kind of the platform, it's really hard to kind of at that point, then creativity kind of feels like happiness. It's happenstance. Maybe there's days you're creative and other days you're not. But if you're relying on that, that may only take you so far. So I think it's really cool to hear you talk about that process because I find myself, I try to work on podcasting stuff or creative output, just at least work on it a little bit every day. Maybe I don't write an entire show every day, but I try to at least keep the habit up, and that way I can, kind of stay fresh with it. So one last kind of two questions, not probably near as serious or as heavy as that last one, but I'm just curious. I love asking people this. What are you watching or reading or listening to these days? I don't want to assume you do all of those things, but is there any kind of content right now that you're consuming in some way or another that you're really excited about?
Wow. Yeah, actually, so obviously I mentioned Brooks' podcast, The Life Coach School, which is always
Yeah.
great nuggets of wisdom. Um, I just finished up listening to Stories of Your Life by Ted Chiang. So there was a movie that came out a few years ago called Arrival, and it had Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner in it. And it's a sci-fi movie and just really, really enjoyed it. Kind of blew my mind. And it comes from a book called Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. And this is a collection of short stories. And he has an ability to synthesize physics, mathematics, linguistics, religion, um, uh, all kinds of things like that in these very high level ways, but to make them into incredibly fascinating and interesting stories. And like I would get done with an episode and just be like, oh my God, my head hurts because that was such a wild and crazy and amazing idea. And I mean, I would tell you about some, but some of them are very surprising. So I don't want to give those things away. And the audiobooks are fantastic. The two narrators in it are just phenomenal. But really enjoy stuff that changes how you think about the world. And these stories all do that. Um, uh, in Arrival, basically, it's about how would we communicate with aliens who had a completely different communication structure if they came down to talk to us. And there are multiple ways of communication. There's audio communication, there's visual communication, there's writing. So there's all these different things. And thinking about them is different channels of expressing different concepts, which for me was really fascinating because speaking German, there are concepts in German that are really hard to explain in English. And when you learn another language, you actually have a different personality in that language. So who
Yeah.
I am in German is different than who I am in English, simply because there are ways of thinking in German that I can do that are very hard in English. There's some things that are in English that are easier than they are in German. There's sometimes where I try and explain something to my German friends. It's like, wow, yeah, and luckily English has twice as many words as any other language in the world, and German has half as many, but it's still second up. So there are multiple ways. There's so many ways of describing it, but for me, I really like things that change how I think, or question how I think, or teach me how to think differently, or break the way that I think. And that's what this book did for me. I'm just like, God, how did you do that to me, Ted? And I would get done with every story and just be like, wow. So I've got his other ones downloaded. I need to start listening to some of those. Like I said, the other one that was really big for me, The Way and the Power was fantastic. Um, uh, Finite and Infinite Games by James Karst. Let me look over on my shelf here. I've got so many books. It's kind of ridiculous. Oh, wow. I think if there's any other ones I have in here. For example, I read one a while back called Existential Kink, which I've been recommending to people, and they're like, "Ooh, that sounds very racy." And the thing is, it's not very racy, but it's the idea that kink is understanding your dark side, your quirks, your things that shouldn't turn you on, but do. They're the things that get you excited that you're not really sure you want to let anybody know. They're the shadow parts of you. And
Yeah.
so what it's understanding is that kink is in the kink communities are very much about accepting you for your weirdness, for that little thing. I mean, that's why, you're not supposed to be turned on by feet or shoes or, whatever. I mean, but is there anything wrong with those things? No, it's just that some people in society think that this is what is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And kink goes, yeah, as long as you're not harming yourself, you're not harming others, meaning, yes, some
Yeah.
people like pain, and pain and harm are two different things. But as long as you're not harming yourself, you're not harming others, and you have consent, do your thing and learn to accept that part. And what I love about existential kink is it's really about shadow work. It's
Mm,
about accepting the things that you don't like about yourself
sure.
because they just simply are part of who you are.
Yeah.
And I mean, my dad and his biggest unhappiness and his suffering, why he was so angry at just random times, was because he loathed part of who he was. That was a core part of who he was. And as an adult and as a father now, I recognize that and I have a lot of compassion and empathy for him. I don't say that him beating us or being so emotionally abusive to us was good, and I don't excuse that, but I can have compassion and forgive him for those things because he was trying to do the best he could, and
Sure.
he was so hampered. And the thing is, I forgive him not because he needs it, but because I need it. Because
That's
if
the
I sit and hold on to, yeah, if I hold on to that, then I'm the only one who's suffering. He's dead. He died in 96. So for me to just sit and hate him for those things, all it does is bring misery to my life.
right.
It's like Confucius said, holding on to anger is like holding onto a hot coal you want to throw at somebody. You're the one that gets burned. The longer you
Yeah.
hold on to it. And I was just like, oh, wow, okay, he's got a good point there. But so for me, yeah, I've just been really trying to dig into things that rather than just regurgitating specific principles about things, are very much about breaking the way that I think so that I can think differently, so that I can reform how my mind thinks about things. Because learning the rope principles has been so helpful. Like I said, it's given me that stage, it's given me that foundation, it's given me the tools that I needed so that rather than just building another stage, I can build on top of that stage something that's even
Mm,
grander and bigger and
yeah.
better. But also I can dismantle that stage, pull the pieces out that are great and rebuild it in a way that's even more powerful. And I think that that's really what I've been working on now. Um, Being inspired by all kinds of different ideas, like even Nassim Taleb's anti-fragile, that
Mm,
idea of how do you build systems in yourself, in your life, in your way of thinking that make it so that you don't shy away from challenges, that you don't just search for comfort, but that you lean into challenges because they are the things that are going to strengthen you. They are the things that are going to make your mind stronger, make your body stronger, make you more resilient. And they are the things that are going to build muscle. So stop. I think I'm reaching that point where I'm less worried about being comfortable,
mm,
and I'm more worried about, am I growing? Am I challenging? Am
yeah.
I facing those uncomfortable things that are challenging and shitty and hard, and that I go, oh, I hate feeling this way, but God, isn't this great? I have a feeling, and this feeling sucks, but man, I get to feel this. Isn't this great? I'm alive enough. I get to feel this feeling. And if I can sit with this feeling, and if I can just sit and feel this feeling and be better about feeling this feeling, the next time it's not going to be so scary. It's going to be a little bit better. And then that makes me happier overall because I recognize that it's just a feeling and it's not this big scary thing you know,
Yeah.
that was there. And yeah, so that's kind of my new bent. And I think as I work on more episodes and I work on creating some courses and books and other things that I'm working on over this next year, that it's going to reflect a bit more of that and those some of those ideas of metacognition and taking it at a deeper level. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to create a community of people who are interested in that, who are interested in those ideas of not just regurgitating the rote things, because again, that to me is just a religion, but how do you take these principles and organize them, rearrange them, and break the way that you think so that you can think better, so that you can start to go, okay, I want to do this thing over here, but I don't know how to think in such a way that I can accomplish that thing. Well,
Yeah.
that's what I want to get to, because I look at goals that I have and go, ooh, I want to do that. I have no idea how to get there, and I don't know how to think in that way.
Mhm.
So I've got to break my brain so that I can start thinking that way, so I can have the thoughts that will help me know how to get there, and find people who can help me to think those thoughts and question those things so that I can get there.
I'm so looking forward to the next year plus of your podcast writings, all of those things, because it sounds like you're putting in a lot of wonderful work on, we hear your work obviously on the podcast side of things, but kind of getting more glimpse of the behind the scenes thing. I can tell there's going to be some fantastic stuff coming up, and I'm very excited. So, kind of as a last question, I want to know, you've got this wonderful podcast, Stoic Coffee Break. Well, where can listeners of this show, Knowledge Brews Supreme, where can they go to find your podcast? And you also, I think you have writings as well. It's not just a podcast.
Yeah. So basically, every podcast, I put a transcript of it on my website. It's just stoic.coffee. So super
Yeah,
easy.
yeah.
Yeah. And that was part of the reason why I bought that domain name, changed the whole show to that, because one, it's super easy to remember. And I really liked that imagery. It was just like one of those, like, oh, as soon as I read that name, I'm like, yep, that's exactly what I want. Yeah. So just stoic.coffee. I'm working on revamping the website. One of the things that I'm trying to do is to create a roadmap of everything I need to get done, and then start looking for people to help me do it. Problem is, I'm a techie, and so I can do all of these things, but it doesn't mean that I should do all of these things. So I'm trying to get more organized, and then I'll start reaching out to find people to help me, because I want to redo my website, because I don't, the design's been there for about a year and a half, and it's okay, but I want it to be cleaner. I want it to be better. And so, and then look at automating a lot of the things that I do, because they are fairly manual right now. And so, which makes me feel reluctant to want to do those things. But I know that the more I automate it, the better I'll do with those things. So it's really just, this year is very much about putting processes in place, structures in place, so that I can get these things done and to reach those higher goals that I want. And so, yeah, come by the podcast. You can also find me on pretty much most of the major podcasting things. My podcast's been out for 5 years now, and so it's on all the major platforms: Apple Podcast, Spotify. Yeah,
And there's
should be
lots
able
to
to find
dig
me
in.
there.
Like you said, 5 years, you got a lot of cool stuff to dig through. So if somebody is stumbling upon this, it's like finding a gold mine. I mean, there's just going to be tons of stuff to check out and listen to. So I'm happy to hear things are moving forward. Got more things on the works, more Stoic related stuff. So I'm really happy to hear that. This is going to wrap up today's episode of Knowledge Brews Supreme. Thank you again so much to Eric Cloward from the Stoic Coffee Break, his podcast, his website, for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. This actually makes episode 62 of Knowledge Brews Supreme. And of course, my long-term goal, or short-term, long-term, however you want to describe it, I want to get to 100 episodes. That means I'm only 38 away from that goal. So thank you all for joining. Please share this episode with a friend or a loved one, maybe someone who's interested in Stoic philosophy. Share Eric's podcast. Check it out. It's wonderful. I'm going to put links in the show notes as well for people to find. So easy peasy there. But be good, be safe, and peace out.
And that's the end of this week's Stoic Coffee Break. Be good to yourself, be good to others, and thanks for listening.